Good afternoon. It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce today's speaker for the presidential address. The speaker is Russ Emmett. He's a professor of economic thought at the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership, and he is the director of the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty at Arizona State University. Russ is the author of Frank Knight and the Chicago School of American Economics, and more than 100 articles, book chapters, book reviews, and encyclopedia entries on topics on the history of economics, ranging from Adam Smith and Robert Malthus to the 20th century American economics. He has also edited more than 10 volumes on various topics in the history of economic thought. He has a particular interest in economist work on the relation of economics and religion. His doctoral dissertation on Frank Knight received the Joseph Dorfman Best Dissertation Prize from the History of Economic Society. Russ holds an IMBA from the University of South Carolina and a PhD in economics from the University of Manitoba. He has held university position at Trinity Western University, the University of Alberta, Michigan State University, before moving to Arizona State University in 2018. Please help me welcome Russ Emmett.
We'll see how this works. I hope you caught it, because it's going to disappear. The last essay that Frank Knight completed before his death on April 15th, 1972, was published in the Dictionary of the History of Ideas at the start of that year, or the next year. The dictionary was the offspring of the Journal of the History of Ideas, founded in 1940. The goal was to provide a guide to the study of pivotal ideas within and across disciplinary boundaries. The preface to the dictionary tells us that historians of ideas respect those boundaries, but make their own contributions to knowledge, quote, by tracing the cultural roots and historical ramifications of the major and minor specialized concerns of the mind, wherever that may take them. The historian of biology, Jane Oppenheimer, remarked that the dictionary was a non-lexicographical compendium of original and freewheeling essays about the history of a number of seemingly disparate ideas, which somehow fit together in a multi-dimensional web. We're talking the 1960s and 70s in terms of language, the flowery language there, kind of fun. Today we might well ask questions regarding who selected the topics and the authors, and by what criteria some ideas were judged pivotal and others not. But in the 1970s, the dictionary was praised for its breadth and depth, despite the contributed essays focusing primarily on the historical importance of major texts written and studied by mostly American male scholars like Knight. Knight's contribution to the dictionary provided him the opportunity to condense the message of his History of Economics course taught at the universities of Iowa and Chicago between the early 1920s and the mid-1950s. But the audience here was a general academic readership. Thus, he chose to start his essay with a short introduction to the intellectual background prior to Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, and then identify and discuss briefly 32 pivotal moments that shaped economic theory over the 200 years since Smith, hence the 32 pivotal moments that are in the thing that you got picked up off the screen. Only at the end of the essay did he focus on movements opposed to analytical economics, discussing briefly Carlylean idealism, I'm looking over at David Levy just with reference to Carlyle, various forms of socialism, and the linkages between the German historical school and American institutionalists. He concluded with a reminder to the readers of the parallelism of economic theory with the science of mechanics. He began work on the essay at the beginning of April 1964, and the last dated edits are from the middle of June 1968. Knight's submitted essay bore the title Pivotal Ideas in the History of Economic Thought. However, because all the essays in the dictionary discussed pivotal ideas, the editorial team retitled Knight's essay, wait for it, simply as Economic History. It's unfortunate. Was that David diving there? Yeah, It's unfortunate that Knight did not have the opportunity to convince the editors to use economic thought, or even just economics, as the title before his death. While the title they used standardized Knight's essay to the dictionary's usage of terms like intellectual history, political history, or religious history, I expect Knight might have been able to convince them that economic history had become its own discipline, separable from economics, by about 1970. Unfortunately, the title has probably contributed to the small number of citations that Knight's essay has received over the past 50 years. Don Patinkin once remarked that Knight's classroom lectures were like a general equilibrium system, which could not be solved until the students were familiar with the set of Knight's articles that specified the relationships between the various parts of the lectures and thus converted their unknowns into knowns. Fortunately, throughout his career, Knight spoke regularly to public audiences. He gave close to 100 talks at universities, churches, student groups, and professional associations. The plan he followed in the essay, then, was like the outlines of his public addresses. He created a list of ideas and provided his assessment of whether any given idea contributed to the progress of economic knowledge or not as he went along. His organization made the essay accessible despite the condensed presentation. In a letter written to his mentor, Frederick Kirschner, in March 1925, Knight mentioned that he was teaching history of economics to both undergraduate and graduate students at the University of Iowa for the first time, and he felt like he was bluffing his way through because he did not have time to make even a beginning at a study of the sources, a feeling that all of us have had at some point. But Knight caught up quickly, teaching our subject regularly at the University of Iowa from 1919 to 1927, and then at the University of Chicago, where the course became a regular part of the economics curriculum until after his retirement in 1951. Knight's contributions during his career emerged from his frequent reframing of past theories in the context of new theorists that he engaged with, especially Pigou in the 1920s and Hayek and Keynes in the mid-1930s. Knight's own economic theory then evolved enough over the years that both critics and supporters of various theoretical stances can find things to praise as well as criticize. Risk, uncertainty, and profit became famous, of course, for uncertainty, and provided the foundation for the price theory courses he taught at both Iowa and Chicago. As well, a portion of the material he had prepared for classes at Iowa was published under the title The Economic Organization, which was reprinted, and copies of that and his other articles were circulated across the United States and Great Britain, and perhaps elsewhere as well, from the 1920s until at least the 1940s. His students at Chicago also produced 3 collections of Knight's articles, each chronicling a decade's worth of his work. The Ethics of Competition in 1935, Freedom and Reform, published in 1947, and On the History and Method of Economics in 1956. But Knight was not the only noteworthy mid-20th century American economist who taught and wrote about the history of economic ideas. So why was he chosen to write the dictionary entry and not someone else? Two potential alternatives come to mind. The first is Columbia's Joseph Dorfman, who published more than Knight did on the history of American economic thought, especially his 3-volume set entitled The Economic Mind in American Civilization that was published between 1946 and 1959, as well as Thorstein Veblen and His America, and Institutional Economics, Veblen, Commons, and Mitchell Reconsidered. Dorfman was also active in scholarly societies, winning the Veblen Commons Award for his contributions to the Association for Evolutionary Economics in 1974, being named a Distinguished Fellow of our Society in 1982, and having, again, our Society put his name on the Best Dissertation Prize, which it initiated in 1990. Another contemporary scholar who might have been selected to write the entry was Knight's colleague at Chicago, Jacob Viner. Where's Paul? We're here somewhere. Both Viner and Knight were honored by the American Economic Association with the Walker Medal, Knight in 1957 and Viner in 1962. And although Viner did not teach the history of economics during his tenure at Chicago, many of the essays that ended up in his Essays on the Intellectual History of Economics book were published while he was at Chicago. Dorfman, Viner, and Knight were, therefore, all eminently qualified to write an entry on economics for the Dictionary of the History of Ideas. Perhaps the reason why Dorfman and Viner were not asked was the narrowness of their interests. Dorfman was a historian of American institutionalism, while Viner's historical work focused initially on the evolution of international trade theory. It was only after the publication of the dictionary that Viner began to publish on the history of religion and economics. Knight was seen as reaching a broader audience because he was a leading economic theorist who also published articles on classical liberalism and social philosophy throughout his career. Also, Knight was one of the 4 founders of the Committee on Social Thought at Chicago in the early 1940s, and he returned to the committee after his official retirement during the decade of Hayek's presence in Chicago. But perhaps what ultimately tilted the dictionary's editorial decision in Knight's favor were the writings and talks he addressed to public audiences. His book, The Economic Order and Religion, was co-authored with Thornton Merriam, and it was a dialogue between the two authors on the practical dualism of modern morality, with the traditional Christian ethic at one pole and the variegated practices and precepts of our secular life at the other. The book coupled well with Knight's approximately 100 public lectures to audiences in Chicago and across the United States and Canada, seeking to revive, and even into Scotland and the UK, seeking to revive in a more sophisticated modern form the ancient, long, widely held moral sciences conception of economics. Knight's public audience was exactly the people whom the dictionary's editorial team wanted to hear and reach. At the start of the essay, Knight tells us that economics deals with the general and hence abstract principles of economic conduct and of the free economic social order based on exchange. However, Knight also put into play another principle relevant to the dictionary's interest, one that he called the central and distinctive feature of Western civilization, that is, liberty. Liberty is seldom naturally free because we all face limiting conditions, but the political priority would be to limit artificial and arbitrary interference by other persons as we go about our lives. To highlight the priority he gave to liberty within economics, Knight briefly outlined the evolution of Western economic thought into 4 stages. The differences between the stages are based on what objectives each society considered to be the proper ends of social policy. To the best of my knowledge, Knight never started a discussion of economic organization by referring to scarcity. What he took from Greek thought was not Hesiod's acknowledgement of scarcity, but rather the fundamental contrast between modern individualism and the social or spiritual idealism of the Greeks. Given that Knight was the first to translate Max Weber's work into English, it's nice to see him mention Weber's identification of the Greek spirit with that of comrades in arms, providing a contrast to the methodological individualism of modern economics. By the way, I'll be proceeding across the quadrants by A1, A1, A2, B1, B2. I think that's the order I'm doing them in anyway. From ancient Greece, Knight moves quickly through the theocratic society towards religious liberty. That's 1B. So I guess I'm going that way. The establishment of the rule of law and political struggles that tipped the balance towards elements of what he called the modern cultural revolution. That is, the combination of progress through freedom and freedom for progress, directed by intelligence. Personal freedom in one's economic activity was to Knight the central and distinctive feature of liberalism, implying absence of arbitrary interference by others, with the primary function of coercive law and government being the assurance of maximal freedom for all. The third epoch, 2A, is highlighted by a story George Stigler once told. Bruce, for you. During the outbound ocean journey to the inaugural meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society, there was a lot of turbulence, forcing the passengers below off the open deck. One day, while Stigler was walking the passageways to get some exercise, he saw Knight in his cabin reading a new collection of Jacob Burckhardt's writings. Stigler remembers thinking, first, how could Knight be reading while the seas are roiling? And secondly, how appropriate that Knight would be reading Burckhardt. Many years later, in the dictionary, Knight confirms Stigler's second observation, identifying the Italian Renaissance, Burckhardt's most famous object of study, as the moment when the word economy took on its modern meaning, that is, the efficient, the effective use of available means to achieve a pursued goal. The Renaissance was the pivotal moment when the door to economic freedom was cracked open. Having already recognized ways that governments were constrained throughout history, Knight then jumps to the Middle Ages, when economy exits the household and comes to refer to seeking effective uses of the means available to the goals that rulers and their advisors established. That's 2B, up there. Until the mid-19th century, after cameralism's decline, the application of political economy to societal management still retained the notion of a state ruler as the owner of an estate. The ruler could encourage efficient management of production, provide a stable currency facilitating trade that benefited both rulers and citizens, and created infrastructure that allowed peaceful commerce, all the while enriching the kingdom. You may be interested to know that Knight's essay in the dictionary has had more citations to his brief mention of cameralism than to any other topic that appears in the essay. Knight concludes his historical sweep of economic thought with the moment when the social and religious realms were separated from their functions in the political and economic order. What the Renaissance began, classical political economy reconfigured. Absent institutions endowed with supernatural powers to constrain freedom, personal thought and conduct could become free. Knight's last moment, then, the birth of political economy, reconstructed the link between politics and economics via the coincidence of the 119-day interval between the publication of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations on March 9, 1776, and the proclamation of the American Declaration of Independence on July 4th of the same year. The fourth epoch, however, differs from the others by the recognition that the governed are now owed the opportunity to choose who will govern them. Knight uses this connection to tie the emergence of the concept of economic liberty to, first, minimizing compulsory control over individuals' lives by custom and law. Secondly, the expansion of opportunities to exchange through experimentation and invention. Third, the push and pull of public discourse regarding compulsory control. And four, the outcomes of legal debates and resulting precedents. It's thus important for Knight to use the confluence of the two separate events in 1776 to connect economic and political freedom. The pivotal idea, perhaps still under dispute, is whether our political and economic freedom can be maintained by consent of the governed. Thus, during the 17th and 18th centuries, political economy emerged to assist rulers in addressing key monetary and trade-related issues. The ruler could be seen as encouraging the development of efficient management of production, stable currencies to facilitate trade benefiting rulers and citizens, as well as infrastructure that allowed peaceful commerce. Despite the ongoing presence of unconstrained governments, the emergence of freedom of thought and democracy helped set the stage for the emergence of a liberalism in which economic activity would flourish. All this market and democratic talk, of course, required what Knight called the archetypical human institution, language, evolving imperceptibly through use. He first made that point about language. He first made the point that talk undergirded not only democratic discussion, but also market interaction, while he was an undergraduate at Milligan College in Tennessee, Eastern Tennessee. It was later reinforced by his friendship with the linguist Edward Sapir at Chicago. Unlike the American institutionalists who trusted institutions encoded in written law, Knight saw language, social customs and mores, consumer choices, and business practices as evolving through use more than edict, and hence becoming essential to progress. Trade is interchange. Democracy is discussion. That is Knight in a nutshell. Unlike the American institutionalists, who preferred rules rather than discretion, Knight emphasized the benefits of both sides of any exchange, even while recognizing that self-love, pride, and even error could always tip the advantage to one side of an exchange or the other. Knight recognized that ideas that he considered fallacious were nevertheless pivotal to a history of economics. This was especially true in his evaluation of classical political economy. The labor theory of value was, for Knight, the fountainhead of analytical fallacy. How's that? The second pivotal area, can it get better? Does it get worse? The second pivotal error was the classical idea that the price of any good equals the sum of the wages, profit, and rent, each of which the classical economists considered to be determined independently of the others. Instead, Knight argued, the current price of a good in any market is simply what is required to reconcile current demand to the existing supply. If the classical economists used a term like natural price, Knight suggested it referred to the reconciliation of prices over the longer term through the movement of goods and resources between firms in response to current prices. Two implications of Knight's definition of economics should be addressed. The first is that the discipline of economics as a scientific enterprise must always deal with the distance created by the arbitrary interference on the part of the government between a society's economic organization today and how it might exist in a laissez-faire state. The second is that it may be impossible to know for sure whether any aspect of our current social organization meets the ideal. Together, these implications suggest humility by economists regarding any predictions based on economic models, no matter how sophisticated. The largest number of pivotal ideas in Knight's essay emerge from classical economics. Not surprising, because his own theoretical apparatus was a merger of what he appreciated from Smith despite Smith's errors. Secondly, corrections provided by late classical economists, especially Nassau Sr., early marginalism, especially Philip Wicksteed, coupled with, fourth, a rejection of Cambridge economics, especially the work of Pigou and Keynes. Of the 8 pivotal ideas that Knight associates with the classical economists, 5 of them were identified as errors. Knight's first pivotal error in classical economics is the use of natural price. Smith's discussion is not very clear because he left open several meanings of the term. But Smith does understand that changes will come about through short-term price adjustments, with the natural price acting as an anchor that fluctuating markets will eventually settle upon. However, the remainder of classical price theory is, in Knight's estimation, mistaken. Smith and Ricardo saw wages, profits, and land rents being determined separately, in part because wages and land rents were believed to be primarily determined outside of markets and therefore slow to respond to economic fluctuations. While the coincidental equation of the sum of the factors returns with the market price is possible, Knight's price theory judged market price to simply be the short-term reconciliation of demand to existing supply, because resources may have a multitude of alternative uses at any point in time. The potential for mismatches to occur, Knight argued, was part of the meaning of the irksomeness of work. What one expected was not necessarily what one received, neither in the workplace nor in the pocketbook. A related issue for Knight was the pivotal absurdity of the classical economist's idea that monopolies can always charge the highest possible price. The basic point, of course, is that classical economists primarily looked at markets from a perspective dominated by their British social context, while 20th century economists had generalized beyond those constraints. Secondly, Knight judged Malthusian population theory to be in error, despite how pivotal it was to classical theory. Knight's key issue with Malthus was the way he assumed population increases functioned to keep wages level with a fixed living requirement, because that allowed classical economists to argue that a given amount of capital in any form can maintain a definite amount of labor or industry. The population principle implies that their numerical increase keeps wages at this level regardless of the amount assigned to their support. Knight also suggests that Malthus was responsible for the assumption that labor and capital were subject to diminishing returns, the third classical error, an assumption that Knight points out is only valid if technological advance is ignored. Knight concludes with a sentence one perhaps has to read twice to catch his understated irony. The historical fact, he concludes the section with, the historical fact has been a vast rise in wages, in spite of a redoubling of the number of workers. Perhaps Knight did listen to the economic historians who were his colleagues in the Chicago department, after all. The fourth error Knight identified among classical political economists was the distinction they made between productive and unproductive labor. While acknowledging that the mansions and the great homes of the landed class and other wealthy individuals afforded them access to luxuries and household staff unavailable to the working class, Smith and others among the classical economists considered these activities unproductive because they directed funds away from what was important, the maintenance of the circulation of capital and the human inclination to better one's condition. Knight identifies that as an error, because he has a different view. The fifth and final error of classical political economy is perhaps one of those examples of not knowing that we are breathing air. Smith's 3 great constituent orders, land, labor, and capital, were knit into the fabric of European and British societies long before Adam Smith. For example, the statement, money is the sinews of war, was first used almost 2,000 years before the Wealth of Nations in Cicero's 5th oration against Mark Antony. Thus, perhaps we should not expect to be surprised when the classical economists followed the French physiocrats in thinking of society as having 3 great orders identified, basically, with land, labor, and capital. The problem with that view, Knight says, is that as with water and diamonds, land, labor, and capital are not marketed as categories, but by bits and discrete items, which differ vastly within each class. All these criticisms of classical economics highlight the point from which Knight's going to move forward, what he calls the glacial tardiness in economists' consideration of the concept of an economy. The correct approach was to be a refashioning of economics via the tools provided by the marginal revolution. Marginalism emerged out of classical economics with the recognition that the economic value of a good reflects the use value of an increment acquired or given up, not that of the commodity in the abstract. Furthermore, the value of an additional increment decreases as more of the commodity is used or transferred. That is, wants are satiable, which is part of the reason why Knight's objections to classical theory. Marginalism is also applicable to the yield of productive services. As production of a good or service increases, the increments of physical yield decline and the value product still more. This incremental principle, of course, was also applied by J.B. Clark and Philip Wicksteed to the distribution of the three traditional factors. Knight concludes the section of the paper on marginalism by noting that its most important defect in the traditional theory is that its factors are unreal. Productive persons, as well as natural agents, qualify as capital goods because they are produced at a cost and require maintenance and replacement. And original and indestructible land is unknown on the market. All three productive factors must be produced, maintained, and replaced. And all are mutually complementary in use. None exists independently of the others. However, and he concludes this section saying, however, in a free society, we must recognize, and underline the word must, that people are, in human and social terms, a category distinct from property. Knight surprises the reader at this point with a move that has two aspects. The first looks familiar, a move towards a system of multiple markets rather than just one, with a degree of simultaneity comprising a general equilibrium system, or perhaps more accurately, in terms of what Knight is doing, a macroeconomy. The second is uniquely Knight's, a focus on entrepreneurs and enterprises in that macroeconomy. Of course, as soon as I say entrepreneur, everyone's going to think immediately of the entrepreneur in Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit, who is often portrayed as a Crusoe-like character, the very definition of the solo entrepreneur. But knowing that Knight wrote Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit doesn't really help us here. Rather than casting the entrepreneur onto a desert island, to fashion, not only a desert island, but a deserted island, he says, to fashion things herself, Knight immediately surrounds the entrepreneur with an enterprise. Production will be carried on, he says, by an organization of persons and equipment with much internal specialization of roles. Such an enterprise will require money and a decision maker, the entrepreneur. Entrepreneurs become the central figures of the enterprise economy. But the firm and the economy in which they are situated form a complex system, rooted in a higher order of specialization. Entrepreneurs buy most of the labor power and property services required from outside owners. Entrepreneurs make most of the economic decisions for their enterprises based on interactions in product, labor, and services markets. Profit, therefore, is the return to bearing responsibility for the enterprise's success. Of course, Knight points out that profit is separable from payment for the entrepreneur's own contributions of services or property to the firm. But as soon as we join Knight in this move, we encounter an economic error that goes back to the empty boxes debate of the 1920s over increasing and decreasing returns. The error lies in seeing increasing returns as an increasing ratio of output to inputs with an expanding scale of units in organizations that is itself made possible by increasing specialization. As Knight puts it in the essay, The principle of decreasing returns is related to any kind of productive agent applied in increasing proportions to any combination of kinds. And all means are means of production. There is no corresponding law of increasing returns, except, rigorously speaking, for a short threshold on a minimal dosing of one kind of means onto another. The expression increasing returns is confusingly used for an increasing ratio of output to input with an expanding scale of units in organizations due to increasing specialization so made possible. One of the longer sentences. The unit in production has various meanings. The subject calls for mention because the two expressions falsely suggest antithesis, but more especially because the tendency of many people and some economists to think that increasing returns with a larger scale is also a general law. It holds for an early stage of a hypothetical expansion of a unit, beginning at zero. The gains from more minute specialization are soon offset by increased difficulties of coordination, unwieldiness, and the costs of management. What can expand an enterprise's activity and size simultaneously is new technology, emerging from the enterprise's research and product development activities. Invention is a type of investment, a creative act, perceiving and solving a problem, Knight says, without knowing in advance what the solution will be. Because the end cannot possibly be known in advance, the activity is not economic in the strict sense. Failure occurs often, which is also the case for the exploration of natural resources. Thus, progress has no definable equilibrium position. Knight points out that selling goods is the same thing as leasing those goods under ideal conditions. When a sales agreement is made, the seller could agree to take a note for the price and receive interest instead of rent for the term of the agreement. Under conditions of perfect knowledge and economic rationality, the combination of sales price and interest rate should make the payment equivalent to that of a lease. The same principle applies for the various combinations of purchase, rent, and lease. To press the point home, Knight reminds his audience that neither our system nor the entrepreneurs who are lauded by it can take credit for success. Profit is the consequence of imperfections in the competitive market system, which are in turn the result of uncertainty and limited entrepreneurial foresight. Uncertainty can be reduced, but never eliminated. Thinking of enterprise activity in terms of the price system, a common error is to believe that humans prefer recent goods to future goods of like kind and amount. But Knight insisted that this ignores three facts. First, I don't want to postpone today's consumption. Neither do I want to consume tomorrow's provisions today. And I can't postpone consumption, right, perpetually. Marshall's homely illustration makes the point well. When eating a plum pie, some will pick out the plums and eat them first. Some will save them to the last, and others eat them as they come to them. No abstract principle of current versus future savings will hold for everyone. For consumption, it depends upon people's tastes. And for investment, rational conduct dictates making an investment that is judged to return above the going rate. And that Knight closes the section on enterprise economies with the introduction of the concept of a general equilibrium relation between all the main variables, prices and quantities, treated in economic analysis. If economic conditions were stable enough for all effects to work out, a general equilibrium across the economy could be realized, such that simultaneously all consumer expenditures would buy at the margin equal increments of satisfaction, and all productive resources would yield marginally equal increments of value product, all prices being equal to costs. This conclusion should be qualified by the fact that the system pictured embodies feedback principles, and these typically produce oscillations where responses are not instantaneous. Knight rightly attributes Walras with the idea of a crude system of equations to capture the equilibrium relation. Thus, the enterprise form of economic organization is probably inevitable. Lending money may not be inevitable, because a loan can always be replaced with a sale or a lease. But with enough economic activity, all forms of exchange will become well developed. Major decisions for enterprises will be made formally by entrepreneurs, interacting with their opposite numbers in markets, and acting directly or through agents whom they hire. But entrepreneurs are, in the end, responsible to consumers and owners of productive agents, and at equilibrium have no power at all. Because, as he said in Cost of Production and Price over the long and short periods, entrepreneurs in the long run are forced to use the most efficient methods or give place to others who will do so. By the way, these tables actually are in the essay, so I'm just replicating them, not constructing them from the sentences that he writes. The divisions of modern economic science, in Table 3. To analyze economic conduct, it is necessary to abstract away from all social relations and interests. Imagine then an isolated individual who is responsible for making all decisions regarding her production and consumption under a given set of conditions. Apportioning her productive capacity, whatever that may be, for maximum want satisfaction will be guided by two principles: diminishing marginal utility and the equi-marginal principle, which is that given her income, when she is done apportioning it among the various uses she values, the result will yield equal satisfaction at the margin for all units in all uses. In this Crusoean context, all risks and uncertainties are borne by the single individual. But decisions regarding the postponement of consumption are not uniform across human beings. Even if abstract rationality would surely call for something near uniformity over time, there's no principle embedded in human nature that determines our choice between goods today versus goods tomorrow. The function of interest rates is to mediate today's, tomorrow's, and the future's consumption without necessitating the theorist or a central planner to make a social political decision regarding our consumption preferences. The decision is a matter of individual taste, and in that regard, de gustibus non est disputandum. Knight concludes discussion of an enterprise economy with two other issues that classical economists did not handle well, probably with good reason. The first is the progressive stability, The first is the progressive satiability of human want. And the second is the link, perhaps unavailable to the classical economists, between exploration and discovery of new resources and innovation. With respect to the first issue, classical political economy held utility to be a condition of value, but not a cause or measure of value. Thus, they missed the pivotal idea that the satisfying power of any good is progressively satiable, which finally enters economics nearly a century after Smith, with the adoption of the expression diminishing marginal utility. For Knight, diminishing marginal utility marked the change from political economy to economics. Diminishing marginal productivity was a parallel principle that was not recognized until later. Invention is an even greater challenge for economics, a creative act, Knight calls it, perceiving and solving a problem. Because the result cannot be predicted or known ahead of time, invention is only partially economic in the strict sense of the word. Progress does not have a definable equilibrium position, and as much as we expect inventions to pay off, they often fail to find useful applications, at least initially. Much the same can be said about exploration for natural resources. Yeah, that's right. Knight then turns to issues that don't really fit anywhere else. The first is the problem of monopoly. Classical political economists wrote nonsense about monopoly pricing because it was less important than most people think. The evils of monopoly power are exaggerated, often because it can be natural, even inevitable, and more might be beneficial. Governments grant patent and copyright privileges to encourage useful innovations, and a large share of those privately set up work in the same way. Monopolies in labor, agriculture, and foreign trade are costly, but often the public wants more of them. A common mistake on both sides of the debate is to claim that tariff barriers will support existing monopolies and allow the establishment of new ones. But protective trade barriers do not necessarily establish monopolies. Knight's comments on the business cycle start with a feedback mechanism he'd already mentioned as producing oscillations of supply and demand, something normal price theory should account for. But classical economists mostly failed to get behind the veil of money. David Hume was an exception. Recognizing that an increase in the quantity of money would raise selling prices faster than cost prices, which would enable business profits to increase while also causing misery and unemployment. The influx of New World silver and gold favored debtors at the expense of creditors. Smith mentioned the losses incurred by feudal landlords whose feudal rents were payable in cash. As well, when a boom begins to reverse, remediation through monetary and fiscal action can be undertaken. But no one knows just when to act or how much to take, while the public opposes killing prosperity. In the other direction, it's not clear why economic declines stop and with what speed the upswing will proceed. Sometimes people see the bottom of the cycle as a stable equilibrium, along with extensive idleness of labor and other resources, which is self-contradictory. Given that Knight began his career at Chicago just before the Great Depression, he describes both the bottom of the cycle as well as the beginning of any economic upswing in terms that reflect personal experience. I just learned in reading this past week that the day on which he married his second wife in Chicago was the first day of the Great Depression. I'm not suggesting any causality there, mind you. Just noting a very interesting fact, certainly for their life together. His engagement with monetarism also shows through. Money must be managed, but in a manner consistent with freedom. Knight chose to use the Crusoe economic model as his starting point because it involved initially a single person operating under mostly fixed conditions, both to utilize resources the person could find to satisfy needs, and to fashion tools that would either make it easier to satisfy needs or to create even better tools and processes that could expand the resources that Crusoe had available. But we are already ahead of ourselves because the Crusoe Knight introduces in this model is concerned only with dividing what is immediately available to uses that Crusoe knows will contribute to want satisfaction. Thus, the Crusoe economy initially features merely the general principles of diminishing marginal utility and apportionment among options available like food, shelter, clothing, on the principle that equal units of negligible size make equal additions to total satisfaction in all uses. But consumption is by no means the whole end of life. And if Crusoe could add some security by maintaining a constant income through saving and investment, personal welfare could be increased. Capital accumulation requires creating value more than cost, and investing requires time. Thus, a rate of growth is needed in light of Crusoe's targeted income, which when reached would allow Crusoe to focus on maintaining the net income desired. Knight tells us that these concepts are pivotal to our understanding of economic analysis. But he also points out that the investment theory is abstract in the sense that an investor could never have the knowledge required for accurate calculation. He closes the section by saying that the main reason for considering the Crusoe economy is to analyze the growth rate of investment apart from lending and interest. There's a disjunction here now in the paper, in Knight's paper. He's been describing his economics. He now turns to people who object to his views, especially more generally, modern economics. So Knight was well known for acerbic dismissals of scholars with whom he disagreed. His comment in the essay that I had before me about Edward Chamberlain, some people know what's coming, giving inconvenient Greek names to a group of vague monopolioid situations, being a mild example compared to some of his attacks on other scholars. The four objections to the findings of analytical economics that he does address at the end of his essay raise foundational issues that perennially get asked of economists by their students and the public. The first of these is the objection to economic reasoning raised by Thomas Carlyle, the dismalness of which Knight identified with the need to give up one good for another in order to get another. Knight suggests that idealists of all sorts have problems with scarcity, which requires us to make trade-offs. But he adds that we could point to the work of entrepreneurs who continually bring us new goods and services. A second objection that Knight addressed was Sismondi's issues with Smith's defense of the notion of natural liberty. Knight states his agreement with Sismondi's remark in The Wealth of Nations, that in The Wealth of Nations, there's a one-sided propaganda for economic freedom, the one side being a political argument based on utilitarianism, which Knight says has nothing to do with economics as a science. But Knight adds that without a clear identification of what Smith meant by the invisible hand, criticism could be leveled at the classical tradition for not recognizing anything that would qualify as a real social issue. Would Smith have accepted a definition of society that made it merely an organization of individuals for the purpose of mutually beneficial economic exchange and advantage? Deirdre McCloskey's bourgeois-era trilogy suggests that Smith would not accept a merely economic response, and I don't believe that Knight would have accepted it either. The third objective that Knight addresses was the opposition that the economics profession faced because of its laissez-faire orientation, an argument he traces back to Sismondi. Sismondi's argument emerged from his own time when laissez-faire had been converted into an ethical stance and even a political doctrine, Manchester liberalism, both of which Knight views as mistakes. The science of economics assumes, he says, only an analytical, hence partial, descriptive truth of its principles, not their ethical rightness. Given his undergraduate degree in physics, Knight often remarked that theoretical economics was as valid as theoretical mechanics. And lastly, Knight objects to the identification of laissez-faire with anarchism. Smith and Knight provide arguments that point out the benefits of market freedom and the measures available in a democratic society to address or mitigate the market failures that remain. Yet for some, laissez-faire means anything goes, the effects of which must be ameliorated or countered by societal and government action. Knight argues that Smith and other economists identified three qualifications often ignored by capitalism's critics. The first is that specific evils or ills of market freedom must be identified and considered in terms of our ability to offset them. For example, the fact that market participants must make choices among differing outcomes ought not to be mislabeled as immoral, and might well-meaning policymakers worsen the situation by inhibiting individual actions that could ameliorate the ills. Or might the measures proposed require actions that a democratic polity can simply not undertake? Finally, in a liberal society, we must demonstrate that the measures proposed can maintain maximal freedom for everyone in society. All of this, Knight concedes, requires a fair degree of legal order. Based on these arguments, Knight concludes by saying that the various movements opposed to analytical economics are not really in conflict with economic orthodoxy, because price theory yields laws more useful for guiding action than any other comparably simple view of social phenomena. Thank you very much for attending my talk. I don't know that there's anything after this, so I think we're done. So thank you very much for being here. What? Do you?
We have 3 minutes for questions.
Well, if there is a question I can answer in 3 minutes, maybe somebody wants to ask one. I think they just want to go for a break. Oh, this one.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, can.
50 years before this test, Knight wrote in Wexford Tugwell, The Trend of Economics, a very nice piece on the methodology of economics, and the title is The Limitation of Scientific Method.
Right.
Let's use part of this, what he explained in this piece, in this last conference.
Yeah,
It's totally forgotten.
No, I think that the themes are in new forms and with new targets moved forward. But his essay in that volume, in The Trend of Economics, is definitely outside the other entries in that volume. And I think that yes, I do agree that that some things in his view have changed. So I'm not saying that he's the same in both cases, but I think that the views he articulates here are compatible with the views he was beginning to adopt when he wrote that piece for the Tugwell volume. That he was at Iowa at that time, and he was still sorting out where he was on things. If you read Tavlis's The Monetarists, in some of the early chapters, you've got an account of sort of how things were at Iowa, because many of the monetarists ended up moving to Chicago with Knight and forming the basis for Chicago monetarism. So you've got this Iowa context that's quite an interesting one, where Knight's still kind of sorting out his ideas. And here we have sort of the final evolution of them, literally, because he died before this was published. Thank you.